So you're new to airbrushing and you're keen to get started. Well, in this video, I'm going to share with you a few beginner tips that are going to help you to get started the right way. Tip number 1, correct use of double action. So when you first get your airbrush, and this one here is the Iwata Eclipse Takumi. It is a side feed airbrush, but it's pretty much the same thing as any other gravity feed airbrush. So all of the tips in this video will still apply. But what most people do when they first get it is they tend to paint like this, almost like using a spray can. And remember, this is a double action airbrush, not a single action. So what you want to actually do is press down for air, keep the air pressed down at all times, and then just pull back. The further you pull back, the more paint's going to come out. And if you only pull back a little bit, you're only going to get a fine amount of paint. So this is how you control your paint flow. So again, from a distance, if I pull back heavy, I'm getting full throttle paint and I can cover my larger areas. Or if I'm up close, I pull back a little bit and I'm only getting a fine line. So keeping that air pressed down at all times. If you put paint on, paint off, and you move with your airbrush, that way you're not going to get a heavier section when you're painting, like this. That's how you want to be painting. So keep flowing with it, paint on, paint off, and no start stop. So what you want to avoid is doing this. Colouring in like this. It's going to feel easier to start with, but you can hear that air's not pressed down at all times. And I'm going to get a patchy finish. Whereas if I keep the air pressed down and I colour in like this, you can see I'm getting a nice even finish, and I can coat back over it, let my air dry the paint in between coats, rather than going like this. And yes, I could probably still get a reasonable finish, but it is going to be more patchy, and it's also going to cause more tip drying on the end of your needle because the air is drying up the paint quicker because you're not returning the trigger back to the start position. I'll explain more about removing the air cap and managing tip drying in another tip later in the video. But even for fine detail, keeping that air pressed down and just pulling back on the trigger will allow you to control the airbrush. If you're trying to do it like this, it's just not going to be as easy and you're not going to get a nice finish. Plus it's going to limit you later on when you start trying to do more detailed artwork. So always keep the air pressed down at all times and just pull back on that trigger to allow the paint to come out, and control the amount of paint that will come out of your airbrush using that trigger. If you want more, pull back further. If you want a little bit, just only pull back a fraction on the trigger. Tip number 2, how to solve no paint coming out of your airbrush. Now this tip now is quite a common issue that most beginners will have when they've gone to clean out their airbrush. They've flushed water or airbrush cleaner through the cup, then they've taken the needle out and flushed through the back of the airbrush just to make sure they've cleaned that rear section. This isn't always as crucial. However, if you do it, and if you also pull your airbrush apart and just manually clean it, a lot of people will go ahead and put it back together, press down for air, pull back for paint, and wonder why nothing's coming out. If I remove the air cap and now I press down for air, pull back on the trigger, and you'll notice that that needle isn't moving back and forth. The reason for that is that when the airbrush has been pulled apart, you need to loosen this locking nut in order to pull the needle out. Now, when you push the needle back in, if you don't tighten that locking nut, you won't have any action within the trigger, and therefore no paint will come out. So now that that locking nut's tight, I go ahead and put the handle back on, and you can see I press down for air, I pull back, and now I'm getting paint again. So that needle is moving back and forth, allowing the paint to come out, which has now been fixed because of that locking nut. Had I not tightened the locking nut, no paint will come out. All right, so if you do find that your airbrush has paint in it, it's clean, you've got air hooked up, everything's looking promising, but you're pulling back on that trigger and nothing's coming out, then check that first, that locking nut, and most likely that's what you've forgotten to tighten, and that'll fix the issue. Another little bonus tip when you're talking about this part of the airbrush, you can actually wind this section in. There's a spring in here that will compress the spring and it'll give you a tighter throw on the trigger, so the trigger will snap back a lot quicker and it'll feel firmer. If you prefer a softer trigger, as in softer on the pullback, then just go ahead and wind this out, so that way it'll expand the spring and now you've got a softer trigger and you can go ahead. And I prefer that, especially when I'm doing artwork that takes hours to complete. I find a trigger that has a softer pullback is definitely a lot better in the long run. Tip number 3, removing the air cap and the benefits that it creates. Now, I don't know if you noticed that when I was painting just before, I was pulling back correctly and using my double action. However, I also did this, where I just pulled that trigger back, pressed down, and that's going to give you splattering. So you can use that to your advantage, but you can see how that's allowing some of the paint to leak out, and it's causing a splatter as soon as I put the air on. So just keep that in mind, because that can ruin your artwork. So that's why it's so important to keep the air press down and only pull back when you want paint to come out. And make sure that when you pull back on the trigger, you return it back to that start position in order to make sure that there's no paint left stuck within the air nozzle, which will then spray out as soon as you press down for air. Now, a little tip, if you want to do fine detail work, you can definitely over thin your paint. So currently I'm running at about a 1:1 ratio. So you'll notice that the paint has been spraying a bit thicker. This is a water-based paint I'm using by Trident, so I mix it with a reducer. However, if you want to thin it out more, you can go with a 70-30 ratio, which is about 30% paint, 70% reducer, and I'll drop the PSI right down to about 18 to 20 PSI. The other thing that helps with fine detailing is removing the air cap. Now, some airbrushes you may need to buy a paint picker cap, but by removing the air cap on the Awada, which can be done across the Awada range, you can still paint perfectly fine with the brush. However, now I'm able to get up nice and close and pull back only a little bit, and I'm going to get some fine detail and fine lines out of the airbrush. Now, keeping in mind this is a 0.35mm needle nozzle setup. However, this Eclipse Takumi can still go super fine. Now, I'm running at about 30 PSI, like I said, with a 1:1 ratio paint mix. If I turn the PSI down and over thin my paint, I'm going to be able to get a much finer line. So I've now thinned out my paint a bit more. I've added some reducer to the cup, and I've turned that PSI down. And you can see I'm able to go finer, and I can even go finer than that if I tweak it more. So just because the needle size is 0.35 doesn't mean you can't get fine detail out of it. Keep in mind, it is harder to use. So once the paint has been thinned out and the PSI has been reduced, that thinner paint will make it harder to use. It will let you do finer detail and you'll get less tip drying, but don't be disheartened if you find that it's spidering out on you. Just persist with it, and you may need to thicken it up more than the ratio that I've just explained. Now, as I mentioned, you will get less tip drying with thinner paint, but the drawback is, of course, that it's thinner. It makes it harder to use. But also, by having the air cap removed, it's easier to manage your tip drying, so you can carefully pick it off with your fingernail. It's okay with a 0.35mm needle. Be careful doing this with the finer needles like a 0.18 or even a 0.23. The other thing you can use is a soft brush or even a Q-tip or a cotton bud dipped in some airbrush cleaner will work. But I always prefer to work without the air cap on. I just find, like I said, easier to manage my tip drying. Plus, It allows you to do finer detail and you can see where you're going. You can get up closer to the page. The one thing that you definitely need to be careful of when you've got your air cap removed is that you don't drop your airbrush. So I highly recommend that you put it in a holder like this. Just sit it in there and that way it's safe. Even if you trip over the cord, it's not going to pull it out easily and drop it on the floor and therefore potentially damage your needle and nozzle. Another little bonus tip and something that can obstruct the paint flow other than tip drying is this little breather hole in the top of your paint cup. So you can easily remove the paint cup by lifting it off. It doesn't screw on in this particular airbrush. And the main thing to look for is that you can see through that breather hole. If that breather hole is blocked, then you're going to have some issues when you're painting. And the paint could also try and find a way out, and I have had it where this lid has popped off and paint's gone flying everywhere, so always make sure that that little hole is clear. So I hope these tips have helped you to get started with your airbrushing. To fast track your learning, you can definitely check out our online airbrushing course at airbrushasylum.thinkific.com. If you have anything else that you want to mention, leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you all again in the next video.